Hello and welcome to today's discussion on Indigenous psychology. I'm going to talk about what is Indigenous psychology and how Indigenous psychology sort of got its roots from and basic assumptions which are sort of different from the mainstream Western psychology. The knowledge, wisdom and practice of Indigenous psychology makes it unique in multiple aspects. One of them is to understand how human mind can be studied from various perspectives. And the pretext of the emergence of Indigenous psychology stands in the way Western psychology looked human mind. Though the mainstream psychology has contributed quite a lot in understanding human behavior from varied dimensions, Indigenous psychology picked up few points which are not captured by the mainstream psychology. And the reason for this is that the mainstream psychology focused on a specific group of people and sort of generalized the findings over every other human being. To quote an example, the idea of intelligence. Intelligence was, or rather is seen as one's ability to deal with environment with utmost effectiveness and being able to deal with challenges. Whereas Indigenous psychology wanted to see if this idea of intelligence holds good in every other cultural context. So, Indigenous psychology wants to bring in multiple other possibilities in understanding human mind. There are three major sources that Indigenous psychology took its birth from. The first one is growth and appreciation of postmodern thoughts. Modernization gave human behavior a new look, new understanding, new attitude. But postmodernism sort of started asking questions on the understanding of human behavior itself. The other example I can think of is personality. How personality was understood as a trait which was universally seen was sort of challenged by postmodern psychologists and started wondering if personality has got something to do with the emotions and culture and the larger context and not merely the trait alone. So the growth and appreciation of modern thought was one of the reasons for Indigenous psychology to emerge as a separate branch of science. The second point is the importance of national identity and how the mainstream thought system did not consider major national identifications. To quote an example, a country like India, where we have multiple cultural sources, we have never tried to understand how multiplicity is still a possibility. If multiplicity is what we are looking at, then how do we account for one unifying law that can govern human behavior? And secondly, it was also very important to aptly demonstrate how human behavior keeps changing at different contexts. A person who stays in India would behave in a particular way. Let's assume about throwing garbage on the street. In India, it is not a big offense and people tend to do it without any spending thought over it. Whereas in other countries, it is such an important concept. And how a same person who stays in India, who doesn't pay attention to throwing garbage on the street, whereas when he goes out to other countries, he is so conscious. What aspect is making him behave in a different way is what we need to understand, and it has got something to do with the identity that we tend to design and derive. And the third point is increased understanding and appreciation of the role of culture in determining human behavior. So it's not enough if we just understand human behavior, we should also be able to appreciate why certain human behavior has a different manifestations. And when the same behavior is kept behind a cultural background, when it is placed in front of a cultural background, the entire meaning might change. Hence, with these three major sources, major approaches, indigenous psychology took its birth. And hence, if we look at all these three points, one striking aspect is the role of culture. In other words, indigenous psychology strongly believes that human behavior cannot be explained and understood without understanding the culture from which a person comes. And when we say culture, it definitely doesn't mean an individual's belief system alone. It also talks about the ideologies, the viewpoints, the place of origin, the geography, the anthropology, whatnot. So anything to do with the roots of an individual can be considered as culture. So with this, we also have to be very clear about the nuances of the term culture, because culture has both external and internal components in it. When we say external, it can be the artifacts, the roles, the activities, the art, the craft, and all of these are external expressions of culture. The way a person dresses up himself, the way a person carries herself with a lot of artifacts, and how does one project himself or herself is the external manifestation, whereas the internal manifestations can be values, belief systems, attitudes, activities. So indigenous psychology would want to pay attention to both external and internal aspects of human behavior, and not merely how a person is currently presented in front of a person. Rather, it is about how a person is living his or her life throughout. Hence, it is a larger picture that a person wants to pay attention to. There are 10 assumptions that Western psychology or the mainstream psychology works with, and indigenous psychology tends to take a slightly different aspect. And now we are going to discuss about all those 10 points. And these 10 points have been mentioned in a paper, in a scientific paper written by Marshall in 2009. And for those who want to get a deeper insight into these 10 aspects, 10 assumptions, please refer to this paper. The first assumption is individuality. The mainstream psychology believes that individuality is a universal phenomenon. Or it tends to believe that individuality is something that you would see in every other person. The major determinant of human behavior is from the individual's mind. So when mind is different, individuals should be different is an assumption which is not accepted by indigenous psychology. Indigenous psychology believes that individuality is one aspect of human mind, but mind also has what is called universality. There are certain common understanding that all of us believe in, which is derived from the culture. Something on the lines of what Jung talked about, the universal unconsciousness. The next point is reductionism. The mainstream psychology believes in reducing a phenomenon to one general law. Whereas indigenous psychology believes that you cannot have one universal law which can explain every other human behavior. One example again is, how do we define the effect of reward? One person might be motivated by a reward and the other person may not be motivated by the same reward. So which means reward as a concept has different manifestations. What works to me as reward may not work as a reward to another person. So there cannot be one common rule, one common law which can capture every other human behavior. The third point is experiment-based empiricism. The mainstream psychology strongly believes that human behavior can be captured and can be quantified. Human behavior, certain aspects of human behavior can be quantified, but in the process of quantification, we are missing out on major aspects of or the nuances of human behavior. Therefore, empiricism is not the only deciding factor, is what indigenous psychology strongly recommends. The next aspect is scienticism. Scienticism is the belief that methods of physical science can be applied to behavioral phenomena. For example, the value system that you adopt to understand to understand physical science, like when you explain molecular reactions or atomic processes, or as basic as describing the velocity, will not work similarly with behavioral phenomena, because behavior is not a common feature that you can see in every other part of the world. What is a motivation for me is not a motivation for another person, or the level of motivation for me this day is so very different from the level of motivation that I might achieve after few days. Hence, we cannot have methods of understanding physical science and we can't bring it to the behavioral phenomena. The extended point, the next point is problems of measurement. Whatever exists can be measured is what the physical science assumes. Anything that exists can be measured. However, the rule doesn't hold good in a behavioral science, because there are certain behaviors which are present in me, but you cannot measure it. Or even if you measure it, it is so volatile, it keeps changing, that we cannot have one common measurement all through our lives. For example, altruism. Altruism that I have today is measured, and the value that we obtain is contextual. It is applicable only to a particular date and time. The same altruism may not be present in the same degree, in the same level after 15 or 20 days. Yes, there are psychometric methods to validate this. However, these are again only measurements, but it cannot describe the altruism that I'm experiencing today, since experience is momentary. Hence, aspects of measurement will always curtail understanding the richness of human behavior. Next is materialism. Again, the mainstream psychology believes that human behavior is like a material which is tangible, which is measurable, which has a fixed structure. Whereas we understand that human behavior cannot be fixed, cannot be tangible. We can only express empathy, but we cannot show what is empathy. We can express love, we cannot show what is love. We can express anger, we can express our thoughts, but it cannot be proved, it cannot be presented, right? So material, we cannot understand, we cannot use the same yardsticks that we use to measure a particular material. The other point is male dominance. Mainstream studies which have been conducted in mainstream psychology has always captured participants who belong to the male category, which means we have never understood the female behavior in its fullest capacity. So it is believed, it is studied that human behavior is influenced by the gender. There are certain characteristics which are expressed by male is different from what female tend to express. So therefore, we cannot generalize certain law without considering the gender difference in it. Next is objectivity, the assumption that we can identify and understand immutable aspects of reality in detached way. The mainstream psychology believes that human behavior should be studied in a detached way without an interference from the researcher, which is not possible, because when we are studying human behavior, there is an aspect of intervention from the researcher per se. Hence, objectivity will not hold good for a long period of time. So subjectivity cannot be demeaned, subjectivity cannot be brushed aside, subjectivity must be accepted. Hence, the role of qualitative research methodologies makes more sense in understanding human behavior, because qualitative research acknowledges the role and importance of subjectivity without compromising the scientificity of a study. The next point is nomolithic law. Nomolithic law are those laws which are widespread, which are universal, which can be applied and understood all through the human race. Whereas we understand that human being is an evolving creature like any other organism on this world, and when we keep evolving, there cannot be one universal law that can govern our human behavior all through our existence. So therefore, we cannot have one common law which can guide human behavior for eternity. And finally, we have what is called rationality. Rationality believes, it presumes a linear causal effect, logical understanding of phenomena. Whereas we know that human behavior is so complex that there are multiple other factors which can affect and influence human behavior. So therefore, it cannot be linear. And certain behavior cannot always have causal effect relationship. It can have mere coexistence. It can merely have appearance together, existence together. Hence, we cannot demand for a causal effect relationship to understand a larger human behavior. So with these 10 assumptions of the mainstream psychology, the indigenous psychology developed its own way of looking at human behavior, may not completely opposite of the mainstream, which is not the intention, nor is it a right way of looking at it. The indigenous psychology started seeing human behavior from a larger lens, on a larger platform. So with this, I am coming to our last point. Now we'll be discussing about 3 different approaches of understanding indigenous psychology. There are 3 major theoretical orientations that explains how to understand culture in understanding human behavior. The first one is called cognitive constructivist approach. The cognitive constructivist approach is an amalgamation of 2 major schools of psychology. One is cognitive school, the other one is constructivist school. In cognitive school, the major assumption is that human behavior can be understood by understanding implicit theories, mental models, scripts, and so on. So the cognitive framework an individual contains within himself explains how certain human behaviors manifest. On the other hand, the constructivist model explains that individual behavior is constructed with the help of the environment in which a person stays, the origin of a person, the overall environmental factors that applies and influences human behavior. So the cognitive constructivist approach says that an individual framework, the thought matrix a person obtains is something that is derived out of or is constructed out of the available environmental cues. For example, if an individual believes that it is good to argue to prove a point, and that's his framework, and this framework is probably obtained by his or her culture, which asks him to be more expressive. His or her culture which asks the person to be explicit in his viewpoints. So human behavior, therefore, is a combination or an outcome of both the individual framework and the external societal, environmental, cultural factors. Hence, if we have to understand human behavior, we have to understand both the cognitive aspect of his or her thought processes as well as the origin of these thought processes which are in the culture. The second approach is called dynamic constructivist approach. The dynamic constructivist approach believes that the human behavior is a dynamic process. So it slightly deviates from the cognitive approach, which believes that a human being will have a fixed framework through which a person thinks and sees. Whereas the dynamic constructivist approach believes that it is a dynamic process and a person will develop the thoughts and belief system as and when the society or the external environment demands. To give you another example, you see a lot of people coming out on street and protesting for a cause, and otherwise they would not want to come out on street. So what changed a person who is not so willing to come out on street is so very ready to come and protest? Is only because his society or his culture is asking him to stand up and fight for it. So this is a dynamic process that a person develops for himself or herself. So therefore, when we are studying human behavior, we have to keep the cultural expectations, the environmental demands and cues that a person is getting exposed to. So hence, it is not merely the cognitive structure, it is also the individual's readiness and availability, vulnerability to get exposed to all the cultural expectations. And finally, we have what is called moving beyond cognition, the third approach, which is still emerging. This is not a full-fledged theory per se. It explains how human behavior is still moving. So therefore, we cannot have one formal theory to explain. So according to this approach, it explains that human behavior should be looked at as a growing organism than as a static artifact that you see in a museum. So a person who is interested in understanding human behavior should be willing to be open to move beyond certain frameworks or certain belief systems. Hence, you cannot derive a universal law. So with this, we conclude that understanding human behavior has always been complex, and people have been contributing to understand this complex behavior, complex phenomenon. And cross-cultural psychology, indigenous psychology, multicultural psychology are different aspects of the new emergence of the branch of psychology which tries to understand human behavior in the pretext of culture and norms. Thank you so much.